Hello, and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. Hello, Warbirders. If you enjoy this video, please do your part and become a member of the channel, or drop me a super thanks, or just like, subscribe, review, or share. It's really appreciated. On this channel, I once asked whether the V-1 flying bomb could be considered a warbird. Now, it was a bit of a loaded question. The V-1 was more of a cruise missile and thus not a warbird. But the piloted Fieseler Fi-103R Reichenberg? Well, that's a warbird. But as the Reichenberg was a development of the V-1, we need to look at that first before looking at the piloted version. As I introduced in my Messerschmitt ME328 episode, Paul Schmidt, who was a Munich-based inventor, began tinkering on a new design of Pulsejet engine and patented his design in 1931, and the RLM, the German Air Ministry, began providing support in 1933. His Pulsejet consisted of a tube of rolled mild steel sheet with a spring-loaded flap valve grid, or shutters at the front, think about horizontal blinds, along with a fuel inlet valve and an igniter, and then just a tube behind. Initial ignition was triggered by an automotive-type spark plug, but once started, the engine flame was self-sustaining and the resonant tailpipe design kept the Pulsejet firing. Each cycle, occurring about 45 to 55 times per second, began with the shutters opening to admit fuel, which was ignited. The expanding gases then closed the shutters, and as pressure dropped, the shutters reopened, repeating the cycle. The resulting engine was called the Argus AS-109-014 Pulsejet. In 1934, Schmidt proposed using his engine to power a flying bomb, and by 1938 he demonstrated that a Pulsejet-powered pilotless bomber could be feasible. But the project was rejected as lacking accuracy, range, and the initial units were too expensive to construct. However, the situation had changed by 1942, and the Luftwaffe approved of the concept on the 5th of June 1942. The pilotless bomb was to have a range of 186 miles, that's 300 kilometers, and a speed of 435 miles per hour, 700 kilometers per hour, and be capable of delivering a 500 kilogram, that's half a ton, warhead. The resulting weapon would end up having many names. Fieseler, the manufacturing company, called it the Fieseler Fi-103. Although it was designed under the codename Kirschkern, or cherry pit or cherry stone. Hitler suggested that it could be called the Maikäfer, or May bug, or the Krähe, which means crow. The designation V-1, short for Vergeltungswaffe 1, meaning retribution weapon 1, was given to the weapon by Nazi Germany's propaganda ministry led by Joseph Goebbels and published by Das Reich journalist Hans Schwarz van Berkel in June 1944. The Allies called it the buzz bomb due to its sound, or doodlebug, which would be closer to the Maikäfer or May bug name. The fuselage was constructed mainly of welded sheet steel and wings built of plywood, with the Pulsejet engine mounted on the top rear. The leading edges of the V-1's wings were fitted with Couteau cable cutters to get through barrage balloon cables. The fuselage contained the compass in the nose cone, then the warhead, then a fuel tank containing 150 gallons of gasoline, then 2 wire-bound spherical compressed air canisters, and then finally the autopilot and control servos in the tail. The guidance system was based on a simple autopilot, a pair of gyroscopes, which would spin rapidly and reject being displaced, would control yaw, meaning right and left steering, and pitch, which means nose up or down. Azimuth, or directional heading, was maintained by the magnetic compass in the nose. Altitude was controlled by a barometric device, just like an altimeter, and was initially set for 9,000 feet, but later it was learned that the engine ran better at a cruise altitude about half that. The two spherical tanks at launch that contained 900 psi of compressed air did many duties, including spinning the gyros, operating the pneumatic servo motors that controlled the elevator and rudder, and they pressurized the fuel system. So these devices kept the aircraft flying straight and level and at a constant altitude and heading, but how would it know that it had reached its target? Firstly, the target was pretty broad, with the aiming point being basically Tower Bridge in London. The air distance to London, based on the prevailing wind conditions, would be calculated, and a little odometer, driven by a tiny propeller on the nose, determined when that distance had been reached. At that point, two explosive bolts fired, causing a chain of events. The linkage between the elevator and servo was jammed, and a guillotine device cut off the control hoses to the rudder servo, setting it to neutral. Two spoilers on the elevator were released, putting the V-1 into a steep dive. The dive caused the fuel flow to cease, stopping the engine. People on the ground learned that when a doodlebug went silent, it was time to hit the dirt. There were 3 fuses to explode the warhead, which consisted of 850 kilograms, that's 1,870 pounds, of amytal explosive. The first could be triggered by nose or belly impact, while the second allowed deeper penetration into the ground. The third fuse was delayed action, set to go off 2 hours after launch, just in case the others had failed. Most V-1s were ground-launched, up an inclined ramp, by an apparatus known as a Dampfungsauge, or steam generator, in which steam was produced when hydrogen peroxide, or T-Stoff, was mixed with sodium permanganate, Z-Stoff, or Z-Stoff. This catapult accelerated the V-1 to a launching speed of 320 km per hour, that's 200 miles per hour, which was well above the needed minimum operational speed of 240 km per hour or 150 miles per hour. Approximately 30,000 V-1s were built during the war. At some point it was thought, these things are okay for area bombardment, like just hitting a city, but wouldn't it be nice if we could hit something more precise, like a ship? This came to a head in 1944 when it became obvious that the Allied invasion of Europe was imminent. Of course, the only really reliable guidance system that could do the job was a human pilot. Unlike in Japan, the idea of suicide weapons wasn't wholly embraced in Germany. Although there were plenty of orders to, fight to the last man and to not retreat an inch coming from the top, there was a distinction drawn between that and purposefully strapping oneself to a bomb and flying it into a target with no chance at all of survival. Nonetheless, there were some that were enamored of the idea, including SS Obersturmbannführer, or Lieutenant Colonel, Otto Skorzeny, and Luftwaffe Oberst, or Colonel, Hajo Hermann. Although the Suicide Squad idea wasn't wholly embraced, a Luftwaffe unit, the Leonidas Squadron, which was formerly known as the 5th Staffel of Kampfgeschwader 200, was actually formed in order to prepare for these type of tactics. The 70 or so volunteers all signed a declaration which said, open quotes, "I hereby voluntarily apply to be enrolled in the suicide group as part of a human glider bomb. I fully understand that employment in this capacity will entail my own death." Close quotes. They were initially planning on using the Me-328 Pulsejet fighter, but it was found that the Pulsejet engines interfered with each other. And so then attention was shifted to modifying the V-1. You should check out my video on the Me-328 Pulsejet fighter. In summer 1944, the Deutsche Forschungsanstalt für Segelflug, the German Research Institute for Sailplane Flight, also known as DFS, began developing the human-piloted V-1, which was codenamed Reichenberg, hence the R on the Fi-103R. In order to make space for the cockpit, the compressed air spheres were pulled out and replaced by a single cylinder in the tail where the autopilot usually was, as the autopilot would no longer be needed. The tiny cockpit was located just ahead and below the Pulsejet intake and was outfitted with basic flight instrumentation and a bucket seat made of plywood. The one-piece canopy incorporated an armored front panel and opened to the side to allow entry. There was no landing gear as the Reichenberg would be air-launched and, of course, never land. The idea was that an HE-111 bomber would haul either one or two Reichenbergs beneath its wings and drop them when close enough to the target, jettisoning the cockpit canopy shortly before impact and bailing out. Although with the Pulsejet intake right behind and above them, it would seem very difficult to get out, but at least there was that hope. There were also training versions with dual cockpits and a landing skid like on the Me-163. In September 1944, the first prototype was dropped from an HE-111, but the pilot lost control of the aircraft and crashed. The second prototype was dropped the very next day and also crashed. More test flights were carried out by Heinz Kensch and woman test pilot extraordinaire Hanna Reitsch, who eventually learned to tame the Reichenberg with her writing, open quotes, "Though an average pilot could fly the V-1 without difficulty once it was in the air, to land it caused for exceptional skill, in that it had a very high landing speed, and moreover, in training, it was the glider model without an engine that was usually employed." Close quotes. About 175 units were built, and there were 4 different variants. The R1 was a basic single-seat unpowered glider. The R2 was the 2-seater unpowered glider. The R3 was the Pulsejet-powered 2-seater, and the R4 was the standard 1-seat Pulsejet-powered operational model. The lifespan of the Reichenberg was pretty short. By October 1944, D-Day had already happened, and so the idea of stopping an invasion fleet was no longer needed. It was pondered to be used to ram enemy bombers, and although testing was done for this, it did not become operational. There was always this tension between the fanatical desire to use all means necessary to defend the Reich versus the distaste for suicide missions, as they were not really part of the German warrior tradition. The Reichenberg project was dropped in favor of the Mistel project, which was where conjoined aircraft, one manned and one unmanned, would fly together to the target. At this point, the unmanned flying bomb would be detached and be guided by remote control by the pilot in the unmanned aircraft. And this will be the subject of another video. It seems ironic that for a suicide weapon there would be so many surviving examples, but now you know that the type was never used operationally, so I guess it makes sense. According to my research, you can find examples, either restorations or replicas, at the Flying Heritage Collection in Everett, Washington, and Stinson Airfield in San Antonio, Texas, in the USA. At the Landschenden Air Warfare Museum, Headcorn, Kent, and the La Coupole, Saint-Omer, France, and there's one at the Schweizes Military Museum Full in Switzerland. There's one at the National Military Museum in the Netherlands and the Museum Moltke in Poland. Not too far away from me, in the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, there is supposed to be one under restoration. Next time I'm there, I'll have to check it out, and I'll let you know. If you enjoyed this video, please consider dropping me a super thanks or join my crew and become a member of the channel. There are advantages to becoming a member with exclusive content, badges, and warbird emojis. If you can't do any of those, then please just like and subscribe. If you like listening to just audio podcasts, look for me on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. It's really appreciated. Until next time.